today is our penultimate no reading required book club for the summer.
I did know that. It's actually kind of neat.
That is penultimate?
Well, that we are just about to finish up. We only have the 1 week left. Because I think the week after that we go on vacation.
It's true. It's very true. I'm looking forward to vacation. We are in the penultimate week of the No Reading Required book club, looking specifically at this book, Hind's Feet on High Places. And what does penultimate mean?
Second to last.
Yes. So, we are looking today at chapters, do you remember?
16, 17, 18, if I remember correctly.
Grave on the Mountain, Healing Streams, Hind's Feet.
Yay!
So chapter 16, 17, and 18. A lot happened in these chapters. A lot of thoughts. Do you remember the book? Because you read it last week.
Well, end of last week. I finished it up, I think, on Friday.
Mine's a little more fresh in my mind.
So yeah, I remember the big things. There's
oh my
so
goodness,
the last
all
time.
of a sudden. Oh my goodness.
The last time we were reading, the last time we met, we were talking. Much Afraid was called away by a voice.
Yep.
To make a sacrifice at a particular place. So she was given a dream. She woke up from a dream where she was to go to a particular place and make a sacrifice. And she goes out of the mouth of the cave, and there's like, it's almost like it's glowing, like it's this distinct, like in this direction right here. This is where you go to. Okay,
not quite how I envisioned it, but yeah, she is being called to a location.
Yeah.
And she is walking, and her companions are relying on her this time. Mm-hmm. And as she gets there, she is getting weaker, and they are getting the stronger, but she is continuing forward.
Okay.
The path led forward to the edge of a yawning chasm, then stopped dead. She comes up with the question, what must we do now? Can we jump? No, her companion said, it would be impossible. Then what are we to do? We must leap down into the canyon. Which...
Can we jump? No, we can't jump, but we can leap.
Well, we can't jump across.
Yeah.
We have to go down, is the heart of that. The follow-up phrase just made me giggle when I read it. Of course, Much Afraid said at once. I did not realize at first, but that is the thing to do. But that is the thing to do. I think that might be my new catchphrase when you tell me something that's... Well, that is the thing to do.
I just realized something.
Are we not live?
We are live. I apologize for the sound. We were on the wrong microphone.
Oh. Okay.
There we go.
Sorry, I'm looking over at our OBS and everything looks weird.
Yeah, I moved everything over so we were looking closer to the camera.
Okay. Okay. Great. They leap down. Mm-hmm. And it talks about how if she was to leap by herself, she would have crashed and been broken at the bottom. But the strength of her companions and the way they leaped, and I kind of almost had a Miss Mary Poppins thought of like, they are her like umbrella that just gently brings her down to the floor.
Yes.
And she comes to this altar, and she knows she needs to make a sacrifice, but it scares her, and so she calls to the shepherd, and this is the first and only time that when she calls out, the shepherd does not appear. And I think, I don't know if you had this in reading this, because the next lines are like, beside the desolate altar in the valley of the shadow. It just reminded me, like, there was wording around this that made me think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Like, there are intentional parallels. Mm-hmm. Did you get that?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
And then there's this really interesting paragraph of thought where she's thinking back on, I don't even know if she's thinking or it's the narrator thinking about it, But Bitterness had said that sooner or later, when he gets you up to the wild places of the mountains, he will put you on some sort of cross and abandon you. And this is the next part. It seemed that in a way, Bitterness had been right, though much afraid to herself, only had been too ignorant to know, and she too foolish at the time to understand that in all the world, only one thing really mattered: to do the will of the one she followed and loved. So it was, I found that a really interesting idea of this whisper of doubt that Bitterness gave her. He was speaking out of ignorance. He didn't know what the future held. He was just trying to throw Much Afraid off in her fear, and yet it did come to fruition, and now that she's standing there, it means something completely different than she ever expected. And it feels like a place of complete surrender, a place of sacrifice. I don't know how much you remember of this chapter, but she sees that there's a priest, and she tries to pull out her own human love to be replaced, to sacrifice it on the altar, and she cannot. She asks her companions to do it. They cannot. They tell her, this is one thing we cannot do for you. Yeah. So she lays down on the altar and asks to be bound so that she will be presentable. And the priest essentially says, I will do it for you. Yeah. And there is another book that this reminded me of quickly. Have you read... No, I know you've read it because I read it with you. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Yep. C.S. Lewis. Yep. And there's this moment in it, completely different setup, with, do you know where I'm going?
Eustace.
Exactly. So Eustace in that book has been turned into a dragon.
Useless Eustace.
Useless Eustace has been turned into a dragon. And that transformation of his greed and his selfishness into a dragon totally transforms how he thinks, and he wants to be a real boy again. And Aslan takes him to a pool and says, you need to take the skin off, and he peels the first layer of scales off, but there's scales underneath, and he can't get deep enough, and Aslan essentially says, I must do it for you. I must do it for you. And that scene came back as I was reading this, written totally different analogies going on, but yeah, they rang true of there are some things that it is beyond what I'm able to do. And with that,
yeah, she asks to be bound because she is afraid of the pain, and that if she has to do it herself and she is not bound, she will give up before finishing the removal of the love. So she asks the priest to do it, and then actually
it's even more than that. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I would not like to be found struggling. Well, the will of the Lord is done. She wants complete surrender and knows that she can't. And yeah, sorry. Continue.
Yeah. So then that sacrifice happens. The love gets pulled out. It gets burned on the altar. And
she falls asleep.
And
then we hit the most interesting thing. Like, oh, it's not going to come out. Part 2. Yep. So part 1 has always been this, I want to read there's my preface. Weeping may endure for the night. And the majority of this book has been about her journey into the high places. And this last act has been a death of sorts. And she falls asleep. Everything's over. And she wakes up in part 2. Joy cometh in the morning. Chapter 7. Healing streams.
Yeah. And she wakes up in a cave.
Yeah. And the altar's still there. But the sun is high. And she is completely alone. Yep. And yet it is a place of peace and life. The altar is the most interesting thing because she is found throughout the book. There have been different times where she comes across water, and the water has been an example of willful and joyful sacrifice for others, self-sacrifice. And the center of that water, the source of the water, is the altar. Yeah.
Yeah, it streams out from underneath the altar and continues on to turn into the giant waterfall she had seen.
Yeah. And if I remember right, I think at one point it's referred to as a river of life.
I think so.
Yeah. So there's a number of my first two real underlines are this whole thing about the water. And she remembers back to when the shepherd had led her and stood at the foot of the same falls, and just how far she's come in a lot of ways. And then there's this really bizarre thing that stood out to me. She sustains for the 3 days she's in this tranquil peace. She doesn't have fear. She's not feeling alone. She bathes, she rests, life is joyful. And the most ridiculous thing comes to mind. She eats wild strawberries and wild blueberries, and all my brain could think is, but those two things don't happen in the same season.
Oh, the only thing my brain could think of was, you're eating 2 or 3 handfuls of berries and that sustains you? They must be really big berries.
Yeah. This place is a place of transition.
Yep.
And there's not really much else to say about chapter 17, I don't think.
Not really. No.
Chapter 8...
Well, the only other thing that is to be said about chapter 17 is while she's there, she is there completely alone, and at no point has she recognized that her companions aren't with her.
No. That happens at the start of 18.
Yeah. So she spends the entire chapter all by herself, and I don't think she's forgotten about her companions. I think she's so giddy about what she has experienced and about where she is that she just forgets to look for them.
Well, and it's long, quiet day pass, like a sweet dream. So I think there is that piece of it, because this is her. I don't even know if it's like recovery or refreshing or. Yeah, just the shock of the sweetest pleasure, and putting her head beneath the clear water. She splashes. She's in the soft grass, crystal waters. Yeah, that's the place. And she slept deeply and dreamlessly as she had the first night when the priest laid her there to rest. On the third day, that's the start of chapter 18. I think the author was intentional about on the third day.
Probably.
And the whole thing I was thinking when I was reading that was Paul's word of dying with Christ, so that we can live with Christ, like that death to self for something greater. Or Jesus' even words that if the wheat doesn't fall to the ground, life doesn't get produced. Those are very much paraphrases. So she wakes up, and her name is not called, but she feels this strong sense at the start of chapter 18, longing to follow. She is being called, even though she hasn't heard her name.
Right.
And she steps out. She follows, because she's still in this valley, the bottom of this grave. And it comes again, tingling through her, calling her down from some high place. So there's like a page about this longing that she sensed, and she comes right to the mountain, and all around her are these steep cliffs, like impassable. And she doesn't know what to do. How do I follow this call that I've got on my heart? How do I respond? And just like at the, and it even words it, just as she had seen at the foot of the great precipice of injury, a hart jumps out, being a type of deer, and it leaps up, and then a hind, the female fart. See, they're on the front cover. heart and hind, and she just knows she should follow them. And without thinking about it, she doesn't hesitate one instant. In that moment, she leaps onto the altar, and then from the altar leaps up onto these very tiny footholds, reaching the ledge of the wall, and she bounds up.
Can I, something that was in chapter 17 that we didn't discuss, I believe, are the pools.
Oh, yeah.
They are healing pools, and she discovers as she's there that they heal her, so she bathes in them, and she heals her legs, and she washes her face
And looks as innocent
them,
as a child.
and fixes her self-perceived deformities.
That's an interesting interpretation, because I just thought of it as, like, being made new.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is why she's leaping after the hinds. She has effectively given herself hinds feet by washing herself in these pools.
And she makes it to the top. At last, at the top, who is there to greet her?
The shepherd!
Yay! This is probably my favorite part. No, it's my second favorite part of this chapter. Never am I to call you much afraid again. And that was one of your issues earlier, is she had identified as your handmaiden. And there were times she had these, like, glimpses of the identity of who she would be, but he never fully called her anything but much afraid, because that was still the core of who she was.
Yeah.
Never am I to call you much afraid again. Henceforth you are grace and glory. New names.
New names.
New names. Okay. And they have a conversation about what was pulled out of her on the altar. Because she thought she had lost her flower of love. And he's like, no, you couldn't. He doesn't say it quite like that, but you could not be here without the flower of love blooming. I planted it in you, and what was removed was the frailer your love, replaced with a fuller love. And
is that also where he reveals himself?
Oh, as the priest?
Yes, he reveals himself as the priest. So when she called out to him and felt like he wasn't there, it's because he was there the whole time. He was the priest.
Yeah.
Which, interestingly enough, gave me the feeling of the gardener.
Oh, like where Mary Magdalene's like, gardener, where have they taken him? What have you done with Jesus?
Yeah, when they show up at the tomb and the rock is rolled away, and the only person they see there is the gardener, not recognizing the gardener as being Jesus.
Hadn't picked up on that, or like that's not where my brain went. So Jesus, the great shepherd, explains that was the natural human love which I tore out from your heart when time was right and it was loose enough to be uprooted altogether. And I was thinking about things like, I even said this in a sermon recently, is like, there are things that come out of us or are addressed in our personalities, our character flaws, at different times. And I didn't have a word to say it, but reading this, there are times where they need to be loosened in us so that they can be taken out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're not even aware of them, even if everybody around us is. What? Sorry.
Oh, I'm watching a thumbs up on Facebook.
Oh, good. Yay. Hi, friends. Yes, and that's when she's like, oh, you were the priest? And then, okay, this is my, I want to say this is my favorite part. There are three things. These are my three favorite parts of this whole book. Okay. Because there are three themes that come out. So the renaming, this is my next, like, they are all equally loved by me. The shepherd asks for her bag of stones. And she gives them, and he pulls them out, and each of these ordinary stones of remembrance have been transformed into like priceless jewels. These moments that were small and insignificant, like they were significant but like seemed like nothing, pebbles in her life, have now become these precious, beautiful gems, sparkling jewels. He pulls out a ruby, he pulls out an emerald, he pulls out jewel after jewel, and sets them on a crown. And she, in this moment, she's like, what if I had just thrown them away in the previous chapter, like in the flood? What if I had gone with that? Like, what would I have had to give?
Yeah. Yeah, she says she would not have had the gems needed to complete the crown, basically.
Yeah. How nearly she had succumbed to the temptation to discard as worthless those stones that now shone with glory and splendor. And after this conversation comes to the last and greatest joy of this chapter for me. The shepherd says, now that you're in this new place, you're gonna have companions. And she's like, I kind of would like my old companions. They've become dear to me. He's like, well, sorrow and suffering have no place in the kingdom of love. I will bring you to your new companions. And she goes and she regards them, and they are, does it describe them? At that, Grace and Glory regarded him earnestly. There were almost tears in her eyes, for she remembered suffering and sorrow, the faithful companions whom he had given her. It had been through their help and gentleness and patience that she was able to ascend to the mountains on the high place. All the time she had been with the Lord and King, she receiving her new name and crowned with glory, joy and glory, she had been thinking of them and wishing, yes, actually wishing and longing for them. So she's taken to these two radiant, shining figures. They step forward, and it's not until they have beautiful faces, shining with love in their eyes and full of joy. Who are you? Will you tell me your names? Instead of answering, they smiled with one another and held up their hands. It was such a familiar gesture. Grace and Glory knew them and cried, why, you're suffering and sorrow. Oh, welcome, welcome. And it makes me so happy. You are laughing at me. I think I cried the first time I read this. Oh no, they laughed. We are no more suffering and sorrow than you are much afraid. Don't you know that everything that comes to the high places is transformed? Since you brought us here, we have turned into joy and peace. Which,
interestingly enough, are the two companions that Much Afraid wished for when she started the journey, when she was offered suffering and sorrow as her companions for the climb.
And if, like, I've been saying, and we've been acknowledging through the whole way, that there are times where suffering and sorrow seem to be not what they had once been. And so I think, because that was one of my concerns at the beginning, is I wouldn't want us to feel like we just need to embrace all sufferings and all forms of sorrow as this dreary part of, like, transformation only comes through almost a sadistic. But here it is, I think, in the process, they were also being transformed.
Yeah.
So, and then they explain, like, we were so afraid that we could only come to this place if you brought us. We were so afraid you would reject us, that you shrank away from us, did not accept our help. We could only come here if you brought us here. And
and she is flabbergasted, basically, because she sees it as they were the strength that she needed to get there, but ultimately they couldn't come on their own. They needed her to bring them to the high place as much as she needed them to keep her upright and moving and facing her enemies the whole way.
And one of the things that truly did inspire Hannah Hurnard to write this was Pilgrim's Progress. That book clearly has inspiration on this. That's the story of someone living their whole life to end up in the Celestial City. The main character's name is Christian, and they go through a number of pitfalls and journeys and distractions that a Christian in this life will live. And when they die, they end up in the Celestial Kingdom. Here's where this is different, because this book ends, like, this feels, if it was the exact same conclusion, that you die and you're now in the high place, this chapter is where the chapter would end. With that, they came to her, they put their arms around her, and all three embraced and kissed one another with love and thankfulness and joy beyond words to express. So with new names and united to the king and crowned with glory, Grace and Glory, accompanied by her companions and friends, came to the high places and was led into the kingdom of love. You'd feel that this is where you put the end.
Yep. But no.
But no.
There's still 2 more chapters.
There's still 2 more chapters. And this is where I think the story is similar, but not the same. Similar but not the same. In a lot of ways, it reminds me kind of how John Wesley's understanding of sanctification is that we have a crisis of faith and we come to Christ. Like that come to Jesus moment people talk about, that initial confessing of sins. That's when we enter the shepherd's service. And there are a number of things that we would talk about as being progressive sanctification, this being made new every day. These small yeses and big yeses throughout our lives are those stones that we pick up along the way.
Right.
So we're with us. And then there are these significant moments. And John Wesley had the idea that there was one specific moment, a second big crisis of complete surrender, death to self. And I think in a lot of ways, like, that's the only way I can explain this part of the book, of the fact that she is in the high places, but the story's not done. It's not like the person of much afraid has died and this is new life in heaven.
Right.
Something else is being communicated, and it's that death to self and made new in Christ, this side of heaven. And yes, there's still progressive sanctification that happens after. There's still holy learning that's learned after. This, for me, is kind of that second surrender,
right,
which is being talked about. And
is that where entire sanctification comes from?
Totally John Wesley. That is, and having taken a course called Doctrine of Holiness, I am sure there are elements of it that those with more scholarly would be like, well, Liz, let me walk you back, and you've missed this piece or you've missed this piece. But in the simplest way of me understanding it, that's how I understand that theological view. And I think now, and even within the Free Methodist Church, it's not one entire sanctification. All those little altars along the ways are these yeses and surrenders.
Right.
And the reason I say that is our next chapters, for our last 2 chapters for next week, are high places and then returning to the valley.
Yep.
So it ends with her going back down. And we'll talk about those next week. But if it was just getting to heaven, that's where the story would end. And the story doesn't end, to the point that this is actually, there's a sequel to this book. I'll bring it next week because I have a copy at the church. It's called Mountain of Spices.
Okay.
And so how that one works, so at the end of this one, we're gonna read that next week. In this next book, I love it. It's more storytelling allegory. So one chapter will be something happening in the valley, and then the next chapter she will be on a high place, and the author says, like, I was inspired of my time in Palestine and Israel where there's these mountains around. And so she puts each mountain to be one of the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And she roots each of them as spices of love. So one is saffron, and each of them has a different actual spice. And so there's a chapter about something happening in the valley, and then a chapter about much afraid learning the attribute of love from joy, the attribute of love from long suffering, the aspect of love from each of the 9 spices. Okay. So Mountain of Spice is the follow-up to this story, but this story's not done. We're going to read about more of it. 2 more chapters.
2 more chapters.
For
which
next
will be, Yeah, next Tuesday. We will be in a different location next Tuesday.
Will we?
Yes, because you have a doctor's appointment.
Oh, right.
So, and since your doctor is still in Kempville, we will be
Not at this house.
not here. So we will set up, but the background will be different, and hopefully the sound will still be as good. But yes, we will be set up at a different location for the last 2 chapters next Tuesday.
Okay, that's it. Hind's Feet, High Places. 2 chapters to go. This was our penultimate lesson.
You love that word.
I do love penultimate. How often do you get to say it?
Generally at the second last week of anything you're finishing up.
That is true. Next week will be our final No Reading Required book club of the summer.
Yes.
With our current summer read, Hind's Feet on High Places. And yeah, we'll see you next week.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.